Ethan never imagined his life would come down to a single drive through a mountain pass in the middle of a blizzard. One moment, he was gripping the steering wheel with numb fingers, praying the car wouldn't slide off the road. The next, the engine sputtered, coughed, and died, leaving nothing but howling wind and thick white silence pressing against the windows. Beside him sat Claire Whitmore, his boss, the woman everyone in the company feared. Strict, untouchable, brilliant, and painfully beautiful in a way Ethan tried not to notice. Ethan was a single dad, barely holding his life together with overtime hours and cold coffee. His mornings began with packing lunches and tying shoelaces, and his nights ended with exhaustion and guilt for not being enough. This job was everything to him. Claire knew his work was good, but she never smiled, never softened, never gave praise. To her, results mattered more than people. Or so he thought. When the car stopped, panic crept into Ethan's chest. No signal, no traffic. The storm was worsening by the minute. Claire's phone was dead too. For the first time since he'd known her, her confidence cracked. She stared at the white wall outside the windshield, her breath shallow, her hands shaking despite her composed posture. They managed to find an abandoned roadside cabin buried under snow. It was old, barely standing, but it had walls and a door. Inside, the cold was brutal. Ethan layered his coat around her shoulders without thinking. She stiffened, then didn't pull away. That small moment unsettled him more than the storm. Hours passed slowly. They shared what little warmth they could, sitting close but not touching, the silence heavy with things unsaid. Claire finally spoke, her voice quieter than he'd ever heard it. She asked about his son. Ethan told her about bedtime stories and scraped knees and how being a father terrified him more than any deadline ever could. Claire listened, truly listened, and then she said something that changed everything. "I've built my life on control," she admitted. "But tonight, I'm terrified." Ethan looked at her, really looked at her, and realized she wasn't the unbreakable force he'd imagined. She was just a woman who had been alone for a very long time. As the temperature dropped, she shivered uncontrollably. Ethan pulled her closer, his arms steady around her shoulders. Her head rested against his chest. He felt her heartbeat, fast and uneven. Then, barely above the sound of the wind, she said the words that made him freeze. "If we don't make it out of this, there's something I need you to know." Hooked before Chapter 2. He expected her to confess fear. He never expected her to confess the truth she'd been fighting for years, a truth that could destroy his job, his heart, or change his life forever. Claire's voice trembled as she spoke, not from the cold but from years of restraint finally cracking. She told him she'd noticed him long before he ever noticed her. How she'd watched him stay late, not to impress anyone, but because he needed the money for his child. How she admired the way he never complained, never used his situation as an excuse. She said she'd kept her distance because power made honesty dangerous. Ethan pulled back, stunned. His entire world had been built on survival, not desire. Loving someone wasn't part of the plan. Especially not his boss, especially not a woman who lived in a different universe of control and authority. "I can't afford to feel this," he said quietly. "My son needs stability. I can't risk everything." Claire nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks, freezing before they could fall. "I know. That's why I never said anything. Until tonight." The storm roared louder, but something inside the cabin softened. They talked, through the night, not as boss and employee, but as two exhausted humans. Claire confessed how success had cost her every relationship she ever tried to build. Ethan admitted how lonely strength felt when no one ever asked if he was okay. When dawn finally broke, the storm had eased. A rescue vehicle found them hours later. Outside, reality returned fast and cold. Titles snapped back into place. Walls rebuilt themselves. At work, Claire kept her distance again. Professional, polite, untouchable. Ethan told himself it was better this way. Life moved on. Until one afternoon, Claire called him into her office. He expected a performance review. Instead, she slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a promotion, flexible hours, and a quiet note handwritten at the bottom. "You deserve more than survival. And when you're ready, so do I." Ethan went home that night and hugged his son tighter than ever. He realized something important. Strength wasn't about enduring the cold alone. It was about letting someone stand beside you when the storm hit. Months later, on a clear winter evening, Ethan knocked on Claire's door, not as her employee, not as a desperate man, but as someone who had finally learned that love doesn't weaken responsibility. It gives it meaning.